welcome back to your Feel Good Breakfast show on this Tuesday morning, where we also discuss health matters on your Feel Good Breakfast show. Now, let's talk about obesity, which is on the rise globally, with 1 billion people predicted to be living with the disease by 2030. Now, World Obesity Day is observed on the 4th of March, and with the theme Changing Perspectives, aims to correct misconceptions and stigmas and get everybody making decisions to shift from single views to shared strategies. Now, with us this morning to chat more about obesity is the CEO of the Heart and Stroke Foundation, Professor Pamela Naidu, and the owner of Bariatric Dietitian Clinic, Claire McMahon. Great to have you here.
Yeah, morning, ladies.
Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much. I think we can get straight into it because there's so much to chat about, and this is something that is so pertinent, I think, for our country especially. What is obesity? Pamela, maybe I can ask you, and I'll allow you to open up the floor with this one.
Yes, absolutely. So obesity is basically defined as having excessive fat in the body.
Okay.
Yeah, it's excessive or abnormal fat, you know, that could be distributed pretty much throughout the body, but the one that we're really concerned about is if it's around the waist and the stomach.
The troublesome area that we can't get rid of, yeah.
Exactly.
And Claire, so when we talk about your profession as a dietitian, tell me about the role that you play in helping people who suffer with obesity.
I think a very important thing is that our understanding about obesity has grown throughout the years. And we really need to realize that obesity is a disease. It's not something that people necessarily bring upon themselves. We need to treat it as a disease with proper strategies, medical, surgical, not just lifestyle. But certainly from my side, lifestyle interventions, teaching people how to eat and what to eat, which is confusing because, let's face it, there is so much misinformation about nutrition out there. There's always a new trend and a new diet and a new quick fix that people latch onto. Unfortunately, the basics have kind of been the basics for years and years, but I see my role to really teach people how to eat properly rather than teaching people how to diet. And hopefully to try and prevent some of the obesity or manage the obesity and all the associated diseases that go with it.
It's almost interesting that you mention that, because do you not find potentially in your space that people are lacking the ability, like you said, to actually eat all the foods, but we're so much more focused on getting rid of, eating less, and minimizing to lose weight, right? It's such a weird conundrum. Pamela, maybe I can ask you, following up from that, obesity can be viewed as maybe to some people just an aesthetic thing. Love your body and you'd be okay, right? It's okay to have some excess fat, like you mentioned, but does it get to a point where it can actually affect your health? Are there any adverse effects to it? Like, is it actually more than just an aesthetic thing, or am I is that a misconception? Let's say that.
Look, I think it's definitely a misconception. I think there's certain cultures around the world where to have a little extra weight is sexy and it's okay, but it's actually not okay, because there's a direct correlation between having excessive fat and ill health. So very common conditions that you may end up having would be like heart disease, strokes, sleep apnea, respiratory disorders, because the more weight you carry, the more difficult it is to breathe. And so, yeah, it's very much linked to ill health.
I'm wondering if we could take a step back, because we say that we're trying to change perceptions and stigmas as well. So the definition of obesity as a disease and trying to help people understand why we class it as that. Claire, take me through that kind of conversation that one would need to understand.
So there's been a lot of research into obesity just over the last 10 or 20 years. And we realize that there are a lot of hormonal and metabolic factors that have an impact towards obesity, and that some people seem to have the genetic predisposition towards it. Now, having a genetic predisposition doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to happen. There's a lovely expression that say that genes load the gun, but your lifestyle pulls the trigger.
I like that.
But there certainly is a strong genetic predisposition towards obesity, that some people, if you look at families, they're just bigger families. And that doesn't necessarily mean that they're all living on hot dogs and fizzy cool drinks, but they are adapted to gain weight more readily than other people.
And that's exactly why we're having this kinds of conversations, so that we can educate the nation and the world indeed on changing these perspectives and the stigmas that we associate with something like obesity, and how we then can be more helpful to our communities out there. We'd love to hear from you regarding this topic. Please do send us a voice note on 063 408 8863. We'll be back with more conversations. It's my Feel Good Breakfast Show. A very good morning to you. Welcome back to your Feel Good Breakfast Show on this Tuesday morning, where we continue our discussion regarding obesity with Professor Pamela Naidu and dietitian Claire McMahon. Now, here's a shocking statistic for you. In South Africa, 7 in 10 women and 3 in 10 men are overweight or obese. A more worrying statistic is that approximately 1 in 7 children in South Africa between the ages of 6 and 14 are overweight or obese. So a very, very concerning statistic, especially when we look at the future of our country. And so we want to understand how we can better help our communities to live a healthier lifestyle. Right?
Yeah, and Pamela, I mean, just looking at the statistic, this is quite alarming to say the least, especially when it comes to our kids. I mean, this is the future of our nation, and if they're not getting it right, then who is going to? Essentially, what's kind of happening to curb this sort of growing statistic? What is it? 1 in 7 children in South Africa between the age of 6 and 14 are overweight or obese. That is crazy to me at such a young age. I mean, organizations like the Heart and Stroke Foundation, are they maybe assisting in this process or trying to deal with this challenge in any way?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. I think the point about the theme for this year is changing perspective. Let's talk about obesity.
Yes.
And I think the idea around that is to address the complexities of obesity. So if you just take South Africa as a case example, firstly, the way we're measuring obesity is an issue, but because we want to do a cross-country comparison, we use body mass index. So kind of that statistic is based on the measure of body mass index. May not be that accurate really for certain cultures, but be that as it may, I think that if you look at South Africa, we're a very unequal country. So which means that the causes for obesity are very different. So because the other statistic around children is that many children in this country are malnourished.
Yeah.
So when you're in utero and you're not getting, so while your mom's pregnant, if you're not getting the right nutrition, actually the roots of obesity for that child can start there. Oh, wow. Versus a mother or a family who doesn't eat very well. So, it is very complex. Even if a child in a poorer area is eating well and maybe even walking to school with the parent, but exercise outside of that routine is unsafe. So, it is not a simple issue. So I think that we need to understand the statistic in that context.
Yeah, and all the other challenges, the external challenges that are impacting that
absolutely.
as well, yeah.
That's for children, but the women's, so there's also gender and health, right?
Right.
So women, you have to think about pre-menopause, menopause, post-menopause.
Yeah.
It's usually around that age and stage that the weight gain becomes an issue. So it's complex, and the thing about talking about it is that so people can understand.
Yeah.
And I mean, we've spoken about children, you've spoken about women. What about men, where we mentioned that 3 in every 10 men are overweight or obese? Where does the risk factor in terms of age or lifestyle lie?
Sure. So I think, just from a medical or a biological perspective, men carry more muscle weight. So the tendency for them to show the weight gain is probably going to come later in life. Whereas for women, obviously it's different.
Yeah.
Look, I think the older one gets, for any medical condition, I don't really like the word disease because it sort of medicalizes everything. I would call it a medical condition rather, because of the complexity of it. So I think that age brings with it, it's like the older you get, the more prone you are to a stroke, to heart disease, and so on and so forth.
Claire, can we talk about the interventions that are available out there for people who might be struggling with this? So one, I guess, being looking at what you take in, healthy food. Is it healthy food all across the spectrum, i.e. the food that a person who is not obese should be consuming in order to live a healthy lifestyle is the same food that a person who is suffering with obesity should be consuming?
I think there's a terrible misconception that there needs to be a special diet with special nutrients or food groups that are left out if you are obese. And actually, a healthy diet is a healthy diet, whether you are of normal weight or whether you are obese. Lots of fruit and vegetables, complex carbohydrates, not too much refined bread and white rice and that sort of thing, not too much fat, but we don't want to cut fat out completely, sufficient protein. And I think modern lifestyles, busy lifestyles, lots of fast food, people grabbing things and not actually cooking for themselves anymore. The high cost of fruit and vegetables these are things that have all had a big role to play in lifestyle factors that affect obesity in our country.
Well, we'll come back and continue our conversation regarding the interventions and what you could possibly do as well, just to live a healthier lifestyle in general. And a question that I wanted to ask is, you know, with things like this keto diet and then this diet, and you should only be eating greens, only meat, only fruits. How do you know which one works for you? All right, so stick around. We'll be back with our conversation shortly.
It's my feel-good breakfast show.
Welcome back to your Feel Good Breakfast Show as we wrap up our discussion on obesity with dietitian Professor Pamela Naidu and dietitian Claire McMahon. Now, in South Africa, in the South African context at least, an estimated 31% of men and 68% of women and 13.5% of children are classified as overweight. We reflected a little bit on those statistics a little bit earlier on. And then the question that I asked Claire during the break was, I remember doing a genetic test years ago that said a person of my genetic makeup should be eating this kind of food and that kind of food in order to live a healthy lifestyle. And we also know that there are so many different kinds of diets. Is there one that works for all, or should we be focusing on these kind of things?
So probably the diet that's been the best researched and shown to have the best effect on weight, risk of heart disease, diabetes, etc., is what we call the Mediterranean diet. So it's the diet eaten classically in Mediterranean countries like Greece, parts of Italy, and it's a diet that is very high in fruits and vegetables, moderate amounts of grain and protein, healthy fats, what we call monounsaturated fats, so olive oil, nuts, avocado pears, those sort of things, small amounts of alcohol in moderation. How they eat is also important. Regular meals, putting time into meals, eating slowly, eating mindfully, enjoying food. And that's probably, on the whole, what most of us should be striving to eat.
It's so strange that you mentioned that, because if I look at their lifestyles as well, it goes against what we generally perceive. I mean, these are people that are eating baguettes and pizzas and pastas.
Well,
they're having afternoon naps, but yet they're still...
Well, that's more the sort of Italian side.
Okay.
But certainly the lifestyle of taking time out to enjoy your food, having a nap in the afternoon.
Lots of walks as well.
Lots of walks. You know, I think that goes together with it, actually giving ourselves time to have a life. So that we're not racing from pillar to post and never have time to eat a proper meal.
But I think with that, just the testament stands in terms of, like, they are eating carbs, like you said, they are eating fat, maybe not saturated fats as much, but they're still getting good fat, and their macro balance is being ticked, which I think for a lot of us, we fall in this trap of thinking that, like you mentioned, we've got to cut it out, we've got to take it away, and everybody gets affected so differently. I mean, you were mentioning earlier something I want to bring up with regards to the difference with men and women, and how diet maybe affects our hormones, our balance, our age. There's so much to take into account. It seems like you said, it can get overwhelming when we try and manipulate each result and take each ingredient for what it is, when it could be so simple, like you're just mentioning now. A Mediterranean diet, it seems so simple, so manageable as well, and so doable. Maybe, Pamela, I can ask you, what sort of other factors impact those changes when it comes to men and women experiencing obesity? Is there anything that one group should stay away from that the other can afford to do, or is it kind of still more or less a blanket approach there?
So I'm not a dietitian, I'm a public health specialist. So my dietitians at the office tell me, well, we run the Heartmark program. And if you look at certain products on the shelf, you'll see our Heartmark logo. And that means that companies who are more conscious around, you know, what they want to give to the public to consume, they put the right ingredients and the right proportions into the products. So it's literally looking at three basic things: sugar, fats, and salt. Okay, and so I think that it's very difficult to, you know, because of that South Africa is also not just a complex society, but we have multicultural genetic makeup. You know, so yes, some people may have this Mediterranean origin, you know, some people come from East Africa, Asia, wherever. And so it's the genetics that we also need to consider. Okay, aside from the gender factor. So I just want to also bring up another issue, because a lot of what we're talking about is very individualistic. I think what we also need to, just by way of interventions, which then impact women, men, children, and everybody is to look at, I'm sure a lot of people from government are watching, hopefully. So, you know, the interventions should be multi-pronged. So you can't rely on the individual to be the only person to take responsibility. Yes, one should, but sometimes factors are against you. In a particular, so in what we call the environmental factors, which sometimes people don't have in their own control. So what, you know, the sugar sweetened beverage tax, for example, that's a very effective measure, which is subtle and not in your face, but it's one way of getting industry to conform, you know. So yeah, I mean, there are many, many ways, but I do think ultimately self-management is very important. So I think awareness, education, caring for the people around you, and trying to build safe communities and safe cities. So a lot of it is the policymakers that could also help us to reduce the burden of obesity.
Beautiful.
Ladies,
Absolutely
thank you very much for joining us this morning. And with World Obesity Day coming up on the 4th of March, perhaps an opportunity for you to glean some information from this conversation and continue to do your research and just to be made more aware of what is going on out there. Thank you very much, ladies.
Thank you.